Carrier and Carrier.com. I've been a Carrier dealer for many years. Carrier has their new Greenspeed Extreme super high efficiency heat pumps out on the market now. Find out more by going to Carrier.com. Don't miss the absolutely essential event in ACHR, the AHR Expo 2025, coming to Orlando, February 10th through 12th. Explore the latest product advancements, best practices, and industry trends, and I'll be there, of course. Register now for free at ahrexpo.com. FastStat at fast-stat.com. FastStat makes a wide range of extenders for multiple different types of thermostats, allowing you to extend the wiring between a heat pump, indoor unit, outdoor unit, upgrading from an air conditioner, that kind of thing. You know, sometimes you don't always have all the conductors you need. And FastStat makes it really easy to upgrade and get that thermostat installed without any hassles. No more fishing for cables inside of walls. Nobody likes pulling new wire through crawl spaces and attics, or even worse, chases here in Florida. Customers don't like it when we drill access holes in their walls. FastStat wire extenders help customers and contractors see real results on time and on budget. Labor's the most expensive thing, if you haven't noticed. Find out more by going to fast-stat.com. I'm a fan of UEI combustion analyzers, and a big reason I'm a fan is because of their overall low cost of operation, their lifetime cost of operation. Now you can keep your UEI combustion analyzers at their best with the UEI Service Plus guarantee. Book your annual recertification online at ueitest.com/service, and here's what you get. Free shipping both ways, a warranty extension for 1 more year up to 10 years max, and same-day return shipping the day they receive your analyzer. Guaranteed. So don't miss out. Get the full scoop at hvacrschool.com/UEI service. UEI Service Plus. More than a promise, it's your performance guaranteed. Refrigeration Technologies, and specifically Viper Wipes, the all-purpose wipe that is really amazing what it can cut through. Everything from mastic to oil, grease, tar, grime, and it's nice on the hands. Makes them nice and soft when you're done. So that way you can go home and head out a-dancing when you get back to the house. Find out more at refrigetech.com/Viper-wipes. refrigetech.com/Viper-wipes.
Hey Brian, we just hired a new helper. We're going to have him ride with you. You know, just to finish up his training. He's already been to school.
All right, mate, how you doing? I'm Charles.
Hey, Charles, I'm Brian. How you doing? So we already have our first call, so let's go ahead and hop in the van.
Let me grab me tools. I've got an adjustable, some tin snips. That should get me through, I reckon, for the day.
We're going to be installing a compressor.
Well, that'd be no problem at all. My AC teacher told me you don't need anything to install a compressor but your wits.
Well, do you have any torches?
Yeah, I've got one of them in my pocket. I'm not sure what it has to do with installing a compressor.
That's a flashlight. Just get in the truck.
My AC instructor told me that the inverter boards cause the Freon to pump faster and more efficient. I tell every customer I meet they need a new inverter. I used to be a bang-up plumber, but when my friend told me what kind of money you make over here selling air conditioners to retired people, I got the first ticket I could find. My instructor says to set the suction pressure at 75. It will generally be okay as long as the split's okay.
No.
I only use a halide torch to find my leaks. My instructor says it's the best.
No.
How long do you figure you run your vacuum pump before you get all the dirt out of the lines? My instructor says run it 30 minutes, be on the safe side. I think it needs Freon, mate.
I think it needs Freon.
If in doubt, add Freon. That's what my teacher used to tell me.
No.
I definitely think it needs Freon. Freon's
the answer to it.
3 months later.
Yeah, I couldn't work at that place anymore. They don't do anything the right way. Starting my own business was the best decision I ever made.
And now your host, the guy who starts all his limericks with "There once was a man from Nantucket," and still doesn't cuss, Brian Orr.
Hello, class. Thank you for joining me today on the Man, I got something in my throat there. Thanks for joining me on the HVAC School Podcast. All right, first off, what is going on with this music? This is some kind of like My Little Pony soundtrack or something going on in the background. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking basic refrigerant circuit. And for those of you who maybe don't have quite the mastery of the basic refrigerant circuit that you maybe wish you did, I would stop. Listen to this later when you can sit down with a piece of paper and actually diagram out exactly what we're doing. You'll get a lot more out of it. At first, it's going to seem a little dry, but if you go through the entire process, you work through the entire circuit, you'll find that you learn a lot. And you'll, especially if you actually memorize the different components and the different lines and the states of the refrigerants and the temperatures therein, it will be very helpful. If you're a more experienced tech, I would suggest that you listen to this while you're riding along in the van with a helper and have them diagram it as you go. If you're an owner, this is a great thing for you to have your newer technicians listen to. So one thing I want to let you know is the three guys who are sitting in the room when I do this class are Steve Worker, who's the British gentleman who you heard in the intro. He's actually a garage door professional, but he wants to learn more about AC. And then the other two guys are actually electricians, and on occasion they act as helpers in our AC division, so I want them to know more about the basics of the refrigerant circuit. So when you hear them maybe not always having the answers so readily, that's why. Buckle in and learn more about the refrigeration circuit. So last week we talked about heat and the movement of heat, which is also called thermodynamics, right? So let's do a quick review of that. What is heat?
What is heat? Heat is like the crashing of molecules, creating friction, creating energy.
What is temperature?
A way of measuring heat.
Temperature.
Measurable heat.
Sensible heat is temperature. What is latent heat?
Temperature you can't see. Right.
Latent means hidden. Latent heat is heat that you can't measure with a thermometer. Okay, you can measure it, but you can't measure it with a thermometer, which is the heat associated with the change of state. We know what change of state means?
From liquid to vapor.
Liquid to vapor or vapor to liquid, either way. Heat is really motion, ultimately. I mean, it's molecular motion.
Right.
Every molecule in the entire universe has some motion. And temperature is the velocity of that motion. So today we're going to talk about how practically an air conditioner actually moves heat around. That's what an air conditioner does, is move heat around. It doesn't make cold. Cold's not a thing, right? All right, so here's what we're going to start with. Turn your paper sideways, and then at the bottom of the paper in the center, I want you to draw your representation of a compressor. If you're uncomfortable, you can do a figurative expression. How does a compressor make you feel? Draw a picture of how a compressor makes you feel. Or just draw something. Steve's already done while you guys are still thinking. I don't know what Nathan Bolton drew there, but it looks a little iffy. What is the purpose of a compressor?
To compress.
To compress, yes. So what does compress mean? I mean, practically speaking, what does it mean?
Squashing the molecules together.
Exactly. Compress.
Creating heat.
Correct. And that's true no matter what, right?
Yeah.
Like if I was going to compress, say I had a sponge in my hand and I was going to compress it. So imagine I have a sponge in my hands. I'm going to compress it. What am I doing when I compress it?
Squashing.
I'm squashing it. But
compressing it.
I'm compressing it. What I'm doing is I'm taking the molecules in the sponge and I'm compacting them. Because a sponge is made of molecules. I'm just squeezing those molecules together. So that's what a compressor is doing. It's taking molecules and squashing them together. Now, if you remember what we talked about last week, you have your suction line, which is bringing refrigerant into your compressor. It's easy to remember because it's suction line and it sucks. It draws refrigerant in, right? So your suction line is bringing refrigerant molecules into it, and that compressor compresses it. So going into your compressor, what is the temperature of the refrigerant, relatively speaking? Does it feel cool, cold of the suction line?
No, it's cool.
The suction line's cool. Yeah, the big suction line is cold. Yeah. Meaning when you touch it, it feels cool to touch. It's cooler than your body temperature, right? And then it comes out of the compressor in that smaller discharge line. And how does it feel?
Hot.
Hot. Okay. Did the number of molecules change?
No.
Did the amount of heat contained in those molecules change?
Yes.
So what is the compressor doing to the refrigerant?
Warming it up.
It's compressing them. Is the compressor warming them up?
Space. Yeah. The molecules are warming themselves up, but the compressor's aiding it by compressing them.
Well, so all that's happening is you're taking the same molecules and you're forcing them to occupy less volume, less space. Okay? You're not adding. Now, this is a little bit of a trick question, because is some heat added in the compressor? Yes, some is, because the compressor is an electric motor, has an electric motor associated with it. And so there's actually cooling goes on when the suction gas comes down the suction line and goes into the compressor. The compressor is actually cooled by that suction gas. There is some heat picked up in the compressor itself, but the majority of what we see in temperature in the compressor is what we call heat of compression, which means that the temperature increases because that gas is forced into a much smaller space. When it's forced into a much smaller space, that doesn't mean you're adding any heat. It's just that it's higher temperature because you're forcing it into a smaller space. So that's the moment in which all of that heat that was absorbed in the evaporator coil, we absorbed all this heat from the house in the evaporator coil, right? Because the evaporator coil is colder than the indoor temperature. It absorbs heat. It goes into that compressor. It's compressed, and all that heat is revealed now in temperature differential. So now we can take that heat and dump it into the outdoor air because there's a differential. Because what does it take in order to move heat? In order for heat to move, something is required. We covered this last week.
Convection, radiation, and...
That's the path by which heat is transferred. But something has to happen in order for heat to be transferred. So if I have an ice cube and I have another ice cube that are the exact same temperature and they're sitting next to each other on this table, is heat going to be transferred between them?
No, you have to have an opposite or whatever.
You have to have a difference, a temperature difference.
Yeah.
In order for heat to move, there has to be a temperature difference. Okay, so we can get the heat out of that refrigerant. We can move it into the outdoor air because there's a temperature difference between the temperature of the discharge gas and the outdoor air temperature. That make sense? Above your little compressor there, just write compressor. A compressor is just one component. So you attempted to draw an entire refrigeration circuit there. So I don't want you to draw the entire refrigeration circuit. I want you to just draw a compressor. So here you go. Well, you're going to need to write a lot of other stuff. So here you go. You can just draw just the compressor.
Okay.
All right, now let's talk about what is inside that compressor. You start with a low pressure, low temperature vapor coming into the compressor, and we'll label that line shortly. But here's what I want you to write in small letters underneath the compressor, beside it or something. Converts low temperature, low pressure, superheated vapor to high pressure, high temperature, superheated vapor. Converts low pressure, low temperature, superheated vapor to high pressure, high temperature, superheated vapor. So the compressor must have vapor to function. It cannot have liquid coming down the suction line. If you have liquid coming down the suction line, there's two possible results. If liquid is allowed to actually get into the head of the compressor, actually into the compression chamber, it will destroy the compressor. Okay? The reason why that's very rare in residential air conditioning, it's very rare for a compressor to truly be destroyed by liquid refrigerant directly, is because in residential air conditioning, the compressors are refrigerant cooled, which means that what happens inside the compressor is the refrigerant goes down the suction line and dumps into the body of the compressor. Okay? So the windings for the motor are immersed in refrigerant. So when that suction gas comes down and drops into that motor casing, it's pretty much any liquid that's left in it is going to boil off almost immediately when it hits the warm windings of the compressor. Have you ever seen a compressor that's cold on the outside and like almost has like mildew growing up the side of it? You'll see it sometimes in commercial applications where you can tell that a compressor itself has been sweating, condensating for long, long periods of time. That's a sign of a system that's consistently had liquid refrigerant dumping down the suction line over time, because it's got so much liquid that the compressor itself is actually significantly lower temperature than the outdoor ambient temperature, enough that it hits dew point consistently enough to grow mildew on it, or algae probably more. I mean, we're talking Florida here, so in Florida, everything likes to grow something on it. In addition to it actually liquid refrigerant getting into the head of the compressor, which can cause a problem, another thing that can happen is the liquid doesn't necessarily make it into the compression chamber, but it dilutes the oil. So it actually acts as a solvent, causing the oil to both be diluted, but then also to be blown out of the compressor. So when you enter liquid into the compressor, not only do you run the potential of slugging it, but you also dilute the oil, because now the oil is being diluted in liquid refrigerant, and that oil is going to be expelled out of the compressor because it's being the refrigerant refrigerant is acting as a solvent with that oil. The compressor requires that it be cooled by the refrigerant coming down the suction line. So if the suction gas is too hot, that's bad for the compressor because the compressor runs hot. If the suction gas has liquid mixed in it, meaning it hasn't all been boiled off properly in the evaporator coil, that's bad for it because then that causes the oil to be diluted and you run the risk of it going into the compression chamber. In some large commercial compressors, they're air cooled, and so the suction gas goes straight into the compression chamber. So it goes straight down the suction line into the compression chamber and then out. In those, if you get any liquid refrigerant in it, you're going to blow the head on the compressor almost instantaneously because you don't have that benefit of dropping into the warm body of the compressor.
Is that just the way the compressor is built whenever they do the different types?
It's air cooled, so you don't have the benefit of that refrigerant running across the hot windings in order to boil off anything that's left. Either one is bad. Either one you don't want liquid. It's just not as quick when it's a refrigerant-cooled compressor. In the case of an air-cooled compressor, the refrigerant's not absorbing heat from the compressor, so there's some increased efficiency there because you're not picking up heat in the refrigerant from the compressor. All right, so I just want to kind of cover some basic things about the compressor. You will also see a couple different types of compressors often in the field. You'll see scroll and reciprocating compressors. Scroll compressors are the ones that are real tall cylinders, and reciprocating compressors tend to be oval or big, kind of bulky compressors. Reciprocating compressor is just like a car engine in the way that it works. It has pistons and valves in it. A scroll compressor uses two spirals that mesh up against each other and they oscillate, and then that actually acts as a compression chamber. So the refrigerant is drawn up, and as it does this, it traps it in smaller and smaller chambers as it oscillates. So it's a more continuous compression cycle. It tends to be a little bit more efficient, a little less moving parts because you don't have valves and all that. Well, let's just go ahead and draw the rest of the refrigerant circuit. On the right side of the page, I want you to draw a condenser. Just your representation of what a condenser would be. All right, and then at the top, draw a metering device, top center. All right, and then on the left, you're going to draw an evaporator. And go ahead and label each one. So label condenser, metering device, and evaporator. Now go ahead and connect lines in between each one. So from compressor to condenser, from condenser to metering device, from metering device to evaporator. Just draw a line in between each. So draw a line through the center of your compressor and through this all the way up through the center of your metering device. So a straight line through your compressor through the center of your metering device. And now on the right side of the page, in the center of your circle, wherever you have space, write high side, and on the other side, write low side. The important thing here is to recognize that when we think of especially in Florida, especially doing what we do, which is primarily residential and light commercial, we think of a split system when we think of an air conditioner most often, okay? And when we think of a split system, we think in terms of an air handler and a condenser, right? It's regrettable that the name of a condenser is a condenser because it's not. It's a outside unit, really. And so it's a configuration of these four different components. These are the four core components of a refrigeration system. Every refrigeration system that you're typically going to work on have these four major components in them. And they're split into the high side and the low side the way you just split them. You can put these components anywhere you want. Okay, in the case of a refrigeration, a large grocery store refrigeration configuration, the evaporators, and in most cases the metering devices, exist down at the cases on the store floor, refrigeration cases. The compressors exist up in a motor room. The condensers are up on a roof by themselves. A ductless air conditioner. The only thing inside of the four is the evaporator coil. The metering device, the compressor, and the condenser are outside. So that's why knowing these four components and these four lines is really critical. Knowing what they are, what temperature they are subjectively, meaning that if you touch them, what they're going to be. So first of all, so you don't burn yourself, but then also so you can kind of feel your way through a refrigeration circuit. And then also knowing the different states of the refrigerants as they go through. The first line is called the discharge line. So draw a little arrow on the refrigerant line, kind of pointing the direction that it's going. So as you're going around the circle, just to kind of remind yourself the direction of flow there. Above the line that connects the condenser coil to the compressor, write discharge line. The state of the refrigerant in that line is what?
Vapor.
It's a vapor, right? So it's high pressure, high temperature. You're going to write this. High pressure, high temperature, superheated vapor. All right, now right off the top, if you guys are used to connecting to a split system in cool mode, the way we often do you ever see the discharge line? Like, do you connect to the discharge line? Like right now, when you're hooking up gauges to a split system out there at Granny Smith's house, she makes the apples, by the way. Are you connecting to the discharge line?
What do you mean connecting?
Your gauges.
Oh, yeah.
Connecting to the discharge line?
Yeah.
Yeah, where?
At the valve at the port.
Which one? The big one is the discharge line?
No, the liquid line.
Did you hear what you just said?
Yeah, the small liquid line.
What line did you just say?
I said the small liquid line.
Okay.
which is the wrong one. 'Cause
Right.
It's
We have a section, we have a discharge.
the small discharge line.
When you see the guys connect to their gauges to the system, they're not connecting to the discharge line right now. The discharge line right now, when you look at a split system, is contained inside of that condensing unit. Okay? But it won't always be. But right now it is. You're not connecting to the discharge line. So you don't have a real sense of what a discharge line looks like or feels like right now. But if you were able to reach your hand inside that condenser and touch that discharge line, it would not feel like touching a liquid line. A liquid line is slightly warmer than outdoor ambient under normal conditions. The discharge line is way hotter than outdoor ambient. It'll burn you. It's very high temperature discharge vapor. All right, that's where you've exposed, because you've just compressed it, you've exposed the heat in that line in the form of temperature by compressing it, okay? So you don't want to, a really common thing, a very common thing that AC techs do is they confuse discharge lines with liquid lines, and they're not the same. They don't look the same. The pressures aren't exactly the same, and it's important to know the difference. You can't check subcool on a discharge line because a discharge line is not subcooled, because what does subcooled mean? So it's the difference between saturation temperature and the current temperature, which means that it's liquid. Subcool proves that it's liquid. Superheat proves that it's vapor, right? We covered this last week. So you have to know the difference between a discharge line and a liquid line. And how can you know the difference? The way you can tell the difference is by knowing which lines connect which components. Knowing that there's no such thing really from a refrigeration standpoint as a condensing unit. That's not a real thing. That's a way that we organize parts in a split system, but that's not a reality in the refrigeration circuit. What you have to know is if you see a line that's connecting between the condenser and the compressor, that's a discharge line. If you see a line that's connecting in between the condenser and the metering device, that's a liquid line. So it's not hard. You just have to know what you're looking at. And by knowing what you're looking at, you will know exactly what line you're working with. Okay? The discharge line is high temperature, high pressure, superheated vapor. Now it goes into the condenser. So what is the condenser's job? Does anybody care to summarize? All right, read the notes. What does it say underneath the compressor as far as what the compressor does? What did I have you write there?
Low temp, low pressure, superheated vapor to high pressure, high temp, superheated vapor.
Is there anything in there about condensing anything?
No.
Is there anything in there about changing the state of anything?
Yes.
Changing the state?
Well,
Okay, when I say state, when I say state, what I mean, I'm probably not being clear about that. When I say state, I mean a change of the molecular configuration from liquid to vapor, vapor to liquid.
No, it's vapor to vapor. Just changes
Vapor
the
to
temperature.
vapor. Changes the temperature.
Yeah.
Right? Or the temperature changes because it's compressed.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the condenser's job now to condense it from a vapor to a liquid. Right. So each component has a job. The job of the condenser is to convert from vapor to liquid. So write that. Converts vapor to liquid. And now beside it on the left, write 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to make a list here. Well, actually, don't write one. Let's do this. Number 1, it de-superheats. So number 1, de-superheats. Number 2, condenses. And number 3, subcools. All right? So what do you think de-superheat means?
Getting rid of the heat. Converting it from vapor to liquid.
But what makes that different than condense? Why is de-superheat different than condense?
Well, because it's expelling the heat, it's getting it out into the outdoor temperature for all the fins and stuff. Mm-hmm. Whereas...
How's that different than condense?
Well, condense, in my mind, is you're condensing something into a smaller area and then you're letting it back into a bigger area and getting rid of the heat.
What does superheat mean?
Temperature difference between
Vapor and liquid.
Yeah.
Between what did you just say? Between outdoor and indoor? Superheat is the difference in temperature between the outdoor and indoor?
No, between liquid and vapor.
Evaporator.
Okay, so let's define some terms again. What does saturation mean?
Saturation is the change of state.
It's the temperature
The temperature.
at which something changes state
Right.
at a given pressure. Okay? And so if we know the pressure and if we know the saturation temperature and we can see that something is at saturation temperature, we know what about it. Let's try this again. If we know that all right, so we know the pressure.
Yeah.
Okay. We know the temperature
Yeah.
of a particular point. So we know the pressure, we know the temperature, and we know that it's at saturation. So we know the substance that's in the lines, the types of molecules that are there. We know the pressure, we know the temperature, we know it's saturation. What do we know about those molecules inside that line?
They've gone from vapor to liquid.
They've changed state.
Or
They are changing state.
Changing.
Saturation means that they are changing state. That can mean condensing. That can mean boiling or evaporating. Okay, boiling and evaporating mean the same thing. Okay, so in the suction line, if we're measuring, so right now, if you hook up your suction gauge, you put your clamp on, you read your saturation temperature and it says 40, and you put your clamp on and it says 40, you know that what's inside that line is boiling refrigerant that's in the midst of changing state.
Yes.
Now, if you reading 40 on your gauge and you put your clamp on and it says 45, what do we say about that refrigerant in that line?
5 superheat.
It's got a 5 superheat. Correct. Don't be timid. It's okay to say the wrong thing. It's fine. This is just about learning. Okay. So you got a 5 superheat, which means what about the refrigerant in that line? The state of the refrigerant.
5 degrees away from hitting saturation temperature.
It means that it's 5 degrees above saturation temperature, which means that it's superheated, which means that it's vapor.
Right.
So we prove that it's vapor by using a superheat calculation. And by knowing the number, that tells us how long ago, at what point it fully boiled. If that number's higher, then we know that it boiled off longer ago. And if that number's lower, meaning we're closer to saturation, that means that it boiled off more recently and started picking up superheat. You with me? Mm-hmm. Okay. So inside the condenser, to de-superheat means to take it from because it's coming out of that compressor as a very high temperature, very high pressure vapor. All right. Now we have to get it to saturation. There's a gap. So let's say it's coming out of that compressor and it's 220 degrees and saturation temperature at that pressure is 110, say. We have to drop 110 degrees of sensible temperature to 110 degrees of superheat in order to get to saturation so that we can start condensing. We're all in the business of rejecting heat. That's what we're doing. We're moving heat into that outdoor air. The heat's moving to the outdoor air. The reason it's moving to the outdoor air is because the temperature of the condenser is higher than the outdoor air. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
So heat's going to move out of the condenser into the outdoor air. But we have to de-superheat it first in order to even get it to the point that it condenses. And then we have to keep rejecting heat in order to fully condense it. And then we have to reject some more heat in order to subcool it, which means once it's already become a liquid. So fully vapor is de-superheating. Once it's changing state, then it's condensing. And once it's fully changed state to liquid, now we're subcooling. But it's all just moving heat to the outdoor air. Does that make sense?
De-superheat is basically changing the temperature of the vapor.
Correct. In this particular case, decreasing the temperature of the vapor until you get to the condensing temperature, which is still saturation. Boiling is saturation, condensing is saturation. It just means the point that you hit that you no longer see that sensible, you're no longer seeing that sensible change. Now you're going into latent, where you can't, it goes 220, 219, 218, 217, all the way till it gets down to 110 if 110 is saturation. And then it goes 110, 110, 110, 110, 110, 110, 110, and then 109. And as soon as it's 109, you're liquid. And now you're subcooling. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. So that's the job of the condenser. It's to convert vapor to liquid, and it does it by rejecting heat to the outdoor air because of a temperature differential. De-superheat, condense, then subcool. Make sense?
Yes.
With me? Okay.
Yep.
Next line is the liquid line. So that line goes in between the condenser and the metering device. If the job of the condenser is to condense, what will the state of the refrigerant be in the liquid line?
Liquid.
Yep, liquid. So it's high pressure still. because it's on the high side of the system. Remember how you split this two halves inside? So it's high pressure.
Low temp.
It's not low temp. It's lower temp. But the way I like to say it is it's slightly higher than ambient. Slightly higher than outdoor ambient. In the case of it, and again, I'm using terms that are based on air-cooled systems. Obviously, when I say outdoor, that changes in heat mode with the heat pump or whatever. But for right now, we're going with what you guys are used to seeing right now. So we'll say slightly higher than outdoor ambient. Outdoor ambient just means outdoor temperature, what the temperature is outside. So if it's 90 degrees outside, then your liquid line is going to be slightly warmer than 90 degrees. So maybe 100, maybe 98, whatever. It has to be. Do you know why it has to be? Why couldn't your liquid line outside, talking about a split system, air-cooled system running in cool mode, why couldn't your liquid line be 88 if it's 90 degrees outside?
Because it couldn't get rid of its heat.
Right. How could it get colder than the thing that's removing the heat from it? This is that temperature law again of moving heat. If you're moving heat from one substance to another substance, it can never get colder than the substance that it's transferring its heat to.
Because it would then suck the heat out of what it was cold.
Correct, exactly. So if your liquid line was 89 and it was 90 degrees outside, well, heat would actually be going from the outdoor air into your liquid line, which would be the opposite of the intent, right? Mm. It's not like this is designed. This is just how pressures and temperatures affect one another. So that's why it's a law. So if you see something like you see a liquid line that's colder than the outdoor temperature, that tells you that something's wrong. In that particular case, the reason why that happens, well, there's a couple reasons. The most common is that you have a restriction of some sort before the point that you're reading. Like, say there's a line dryer inside the unit that's restricted, that's acting as a metering device, causing the refrigerant to expand on the other side, which causes a decrease in temperature. If you remember what we talked about, when you compress something, the temperature increases. When you decrease the pressure, the temperature decreases. That's how you find restrictions. Because when you've got something that's pressurized on, say it going into a line dryer and it's higher pressure on this side and it's lower pressure on the other side, the point at which it's restricted, you're going to see a temperature differential there. You're going to see it go from warmer to cooler across that restriction. Because of the law that when something is compressed, the temperature increases, and when the pressure decreases, the temperature decreases.
Like a kink line as well.
Correct. If you were to take a liquid line and go kinking it in half, the pressure on this side would increase, and so the temperature would increase, and the pressure on the other side would decrease, and so it would be lower temperature on the opposite side of that kink. But it's important for you to know which direction the refrigerant's flowing, otherwise you're going to get confused too. You can think, well, it's restricting one direction when it's actually restricting the other direction. So you have to know the direction of flow. Just talking about the liquid line, so it needs to be slightly warmer than ambient temperature. It's going to be high pressure liquid. Again, it's still on the high side, so it's a high pressure line. But other than that, it's very different than the discharge line. So if you think they're the same, if you confuse them, you're going to be all messed up. I saw a guy in one of the Facebook groups the other day. What was he saying? He was saying he had, I have minus 60 degrees of subcool or something like that. And what he was talking about is he was trying to read subcool on the discharge line, which you can't read subcool on the discharge line. That's a superheated gas. So it's the opposite. When you read something that's above saturation, that's not called minus subcool. That's called superheat. And that's proving that it's a vapor. So you guys get where I'm going with this. So if you get the two confused, you're going to be messed up. If you put a liquid line dryer on the discharge line, you're going to destroy the liquid line dryer. That's why you have to know. That's another reason why you have to know the difference. If you think that a discharge line muffler, if you ever seen a compressor, coming off the compressor, there's a little shell that looks like a liquid line right on the outlet of the compressor. That's not a liquid line dryer. That's a muffler. A muffler is not the same. It's just a shell basically that allows the refrigerant to expand and keeps it from vibrating and cavitating. If you put a liquid line dryer in there, you can destroy the entire air conditioner, depending on what brand you put in. And there's some that actually have desiccant beads in there. I had a guy when I was working at my previous company years ago who put a liquid line dryer in the discharge line because he thought he was supposed to replace the dryer. And by replace the dryer, he replaced the muffler with a dryer. And it blew the desiccant beads out into the whole system and just contaminated everything. So knowing the difference between a discharge line and a liquid line is fairly important. That's the point here. All right, any questions about that? liquid line, what it does, subcool, superheat, saturation. So then we hit the metering device, okay? And what do you think the job of the metering device is?
To meter the flow.
To tell you what the pressures are.
To tell you what the pressures
Well,
are?
to tell
Show
it's
you what.
That's the talking metering device.
Yes.
I love
You
that
have
one.
of those?
Yeah. The pressures are 72
I
psi.
actually have one that has Steve's voice. It's great.
I bet. Yeah. A little bit of that raspy smoker British. Yeah, that's a good combo.
It's great.
Yeah.
it's to
All right. So the job of the metering device is to meter. You're correct, but it actually reduces the pressure, resulting in boiling. Again, there's 1,000 different ways you could say this. So if you want to reword that in a different way, it restricts the flow of refrigerant to result in a flash gas. It meters the flow of refrigerant, resulting in evaporation in the evaporator. There's all kinds of different ways. They all mean the same thing. You're taking liquid refrigerant, you're creating a significant pressure drop. That results in the expansion of that refrigerant and boiling, evaporation, whatever you want to call it. I like to use the term boiling because it helps break our societal norms of what boiling is. It helps you remember, oh yeah, refrigerant boils at a low temperature compared to what we're used to seeing. We're used to thinking of water boiling, and we think of that as being a high temperature at atmospheric pressure. But did you know that water doesn't even always boil at 212 degrees? We talked about this last time a little bit. But do you know that every time that you're working on an air conditioner with a technician and they do a major repair, you are actually observing water boiling at atmospheric temperature? Water, not refrigerant, water. I see the anticipation in your faces. This is so great. It's every time they pull a vacuum. When you pull a vacuum, that's primarily the job of a vacuum.
remove moisture.
Right, because a vacuum can't remove liquid moisture. It removes it by reducing the pressure to the point that any water that was in that system would actually start to boil. But in certain circumstances, you'll be pulling a vacuum and it'll be going on great. It'll be going on swimmingly, as they would say in Great Britain, I think. It'll just keep dropping. The pressure's dropping, and then all of a sudden it'll hit, like it will just stall. It'll just sit there. It's like, what is going on? Like it was dropping great, and then all of a sudden it hits this point, and then it just stalls. And then after it runs a while longer, then it'll start to drop again, and it's all happy. What happens is it's dropping down, the pressure's dropping, and then all of a sudden it hits the boiling temperature of water at ambient temperature. So if the boiling point of water at, and you know what, I'm going to pull up a micron gauge. Let's say that it's 76 degrees outside. It will stall out at 22,000 microns, actually, at 76 degrees outside. So 76 degrees outside, you'll pull down until you hit 22,000 microns. So at 76 degrees, water will boil at 22,000 microns of vacuum. You have this liquid water. It's sitting there all fat and happy. The pressure around is decreasing, and then it hits this point, and now the water starts boiling. The molecules start flying off of the liquid water, and that starts making up the difference in the vacuum. And so now the vacuum can't go down any further while all these free molecules start appearing in the vacuum pump. And so you are observing water boiling at 76 degrees in that circumstance. Under normal circumstances, it will only be a very, very small amount. Usually it's moisture in the air that's condensed inside the lines, and you're removing that. If for some reason actual water got in there, like, you were doing something in the rain and rain was pouring in the AC system or something, well, that's a significant problem. Like if you have a significantly wet system, that's bad. So now you have to, you do a triple evacuation and other things in order to try to compensate for that. Keep changing your vacuum pump oil. But the whole point of this is just to tell you that you do observe water boiling at times, and that it is all about the changes in pressure that affect the boiling temperature of different substances.
And is that the vapor you see coming out your vacuum pump?
Yeah, some of that is just condensation, so that actually occurs when it hits the air around. But yeah, it can be. Yeah. And whenever you see your oil foul, like your oil goes from nice clear oil in your vacuum pump to creamy, that's a sign of moisture fouling. Like you're actually getting moisture out of the system.
Moisture,
significant amount of moisture. And by the way, whenever you do that, you change your oil, and you should be changing your oil regularly anyway. I know guys aren't great about that, but that's something that you should definitely be doing. It inhibits the ability for the vacuum pump to work, even when the oil's just dirty. But when it's fouled like that, when it actually gets creamy, yeah, you're done. You need to start doing triple evacuation and actually doing some serious moisture remediation.
It makes a big difference changing the oil in the speed of it coming down to 500 as well.
Absolutely.
A big difference.
Right. And 500, so 500 is sort of shorthand that we use, because based on this temperature chart, if you get down to 500 microns, you're going to boil off as low as right about -5, -10, right in that range. Now, if you were in a case where you were trying to pull a vacuum when it was -24 outside, you would have to pull it down to 254 microns for it to even boil off the water. So on a hotter day, any moisture is going to boil quicker than on a colder day. But in general, we say 500 microns. That's just sort of shorthand. You know, if you pull a 500 micron vacuum, you're in pretty good shape. Some guys say you need to pull a 300 micron vacuum, and maybe in some deep refrigeration circumstances, because in refrigeration, the colder you're running the evaporator, the more important it is to get every single bit of moisture out, because it's, it will actually freeze inside the metering device. Where are we at? We're in the metering device. So the job of the metering device is to reduce the pressure resulting in boiling. Do you understand why reducing the pressure results in boiling?
No.
Okay. When you reduce the pressure on something, you also reduce the temperature of something, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And when in comparison to the air around it, if the temperature is lower than the air around it, then heat's going to start going out of the air around it into that substance. Reducing the pressure, you reduce the temperature. In the case of a metering device, we reduce the pressure so quickly, so rapidly, that almost instantaneously that refrigerant starts to change state from liquid to vapor. And that's the term flash gas. In fact, in most cases, statistically, it's like it goes immediately from 20% of the liquid, it changes to vapor almost immediately as soon as it comes out the other side of the metering device. So it's coming out and it's boiling because you've given it increased volume. So it goes through this tiny, tiny hole, right, that's backing up the liquid refrigerant behind it, and it comes through. And now there's this huge pressure drop because you're regulating the amount that's coming through, and it hits this greatly increased volume when it hits the coil. So it just goes, and the bonds start breaking in between, and they start boiling off. And now heat starts coming out of the air around it into that refrigerant because the temperature is lower, thus boiling. Got it? Does that make sense? No.
I don't understand how reducing the pressure turns it from a liquid to a vapor. I would think you have to increase the pressure to force it through to get it to go to its boiling point. I don't get, it sounds opposite to what it should be.
Okay, so a compressor, you put something, so think of it as the opposite of a compressor, okay? In a compressor, you compress it, and what happens to the temperature?
Gets hot.
The temperature increases.
Yeah.
Okay? When you release that pressure, the temperature decreases.
Yeah.
Think of the ping pong balls.
Yeah.
When they're in a tight space, they bounce faster.
Yeah.
When they have more room per molecule, they bounce slower.
Yeah.
Temperature is just molecular velocity. We think of temperature and heat, we get them so confused in our brains. We think of them as such the same thing, and they're not the same thing.
I've got it. So as it comes through the little hole and gets into a big space.
Right. Now they're frying.
Right.
Correct. And when you think of different states of refrigerant, think of it like bonds. Like you're packing them together in a liquid, and you're packing them together even more in a solid. And as you release the bonds, as these are given more space, they expand.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's what you're doing when you're pulling a vacuum on a system with moisture in it. You're actually pulling those molecules apart to make them into a vapor. That's one way of thinking about it. But that's just the relationship between pressure and temperature. And thinking of the ping pong balls in the room helps you remember temperature is just molecular velocity. And when you have a contained gas or contained vapor or liquid, the lower volume that you give it, that's the definition of compression. If you take the same amount of molecules and you give them a smaller space to occupy, that's what compressing means. The more you compact them, the faster those little molecules are going to move. And that's why you think about the ping pong balls. You take ping pong balls and you smash them together, they're going to just be, they're going to be going really, really fast.
Well, once it goes through the metering device and explodes, that's what its velocity comes.
Well, no, it's not. It's not actually. They actually slow down. It expand. They all expand and they move away from each other. But now they're not bouncing off each other anymore. Now they move more slowly. Don't think of it like an explosion or something. So don't use those terms if that hurts you. They're all packed together in the liquid line. They're bouncing around fast, comparatively speaking. Now they hit the metering device, and they're able to just separate from one another. And as they slow down, that's the definition of decrease in temperature. When molecules are forced to occupy less space, they move faster. When they are given more space, they move slower. And since everything seeks equilibrium, when they're given their opportunity to seek equilibrium, they're going to seek equilibrium with the air that surrounds them, therefore absorbing heat in order to try to balance out with the air temperature around it. Now we're going to talk about the most neglected line, and that is our next line, the one that goes from the metering device to the evaporator. Does anybody know what it's called?
I thought it was still the liquid line.
No, it wouldn't be liquid line because it's no longer liquid. It's now a saturated, boiling liquid vapor mix. That's not the suction line.
Suction lines in between.
Suction lines in between the evaporator and compressor, right? It's called the expansion line. Some people call it the flash gas line, I've heard. The expansion line is the one I learned at school. So go ahead and write that, expansion line. And why do you think it's called the expansion line?
Because it's expanding.
Yeah, I know. Air conditioning is great for how obvious the terms are within the refrigeration circuit. It's really nice. So it's the expansion line. It's expanding, all right? It's a low temperature, low pressure, boiling liquid vapor mix.
So through the metering device, not all of it boils off.
Correct. If it did, then the only thing in that evaporator coil would be superheating, and that would be extremely inefficient. The bulk of heat is transferred in the saturation phase. Because remember how we talked about far more heat is transferred when something's changing state than when you're cooling or heating it beyond the change of state. When you take 1 pound of water and increase the temperature by 1 degree, what's that called? The amount of heat it takes to increase the temperature of 1 pound of water, 1 BTU. Right. Takes it. So when you hit this point at which you're changing it from 212 degree water to 212 degree vapor, that's far, far more heat is transferred in that change of state, that latent heat transfer, than there is in the sensible heat transfer. Right? With me? It leaves that metering device. It goes down the expansion line. Now, real quickly, is this just an intellectual exercise? Because do you ever see an expansion line? Do you ever see the line that goes in between the metering device and the evaporator?
Well, only when you take it apart or you take the covers off and stuff. I mean, you can see it then, but it's not an exposed line.
Most systems that you see, the metering device is mounted essentially right on the evaporator coil. So there's really hardly a line. But in the ductless system, have you noticed that we insulate both lines? All right, in a regular split system, it's the top right and the bottom left lines are the ones that you see in cool mode. You see the liquid and you see the suction line, right? In a ductless system, you see both low side lines, the expansion line and the suction line. They don't have a liquid line. They have one, but it's inside the condenser. Inside the condensing unit, I should say. Inside the outside unit. And that's why both of those lines are cold, or feel cold to you. That's why both of them condensate. That's why they both need to be insulated. Because the one line is the line that goes between the metering device and the evaporator, and the other line is the line that goes between the evaporator and the compressor.
So metering device. So TXV is a metering device.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
A piston is a metering device. A capillary tube is a metering device. Anything that restricts the flow of refrigerant in a designed way is a metering device. I already did an episode in the podcast where I talked about TXVs, but the purpose of a TXV is that it can adjust to varying load conditions. So a TXV is able to open or shut depending on the requirements of load, and a fixed orifice is not. Fixed orifice is just a hunk of brass with a hole through the center. What a TXV actually does is it actually regulates superheat. It measures the superheat at the outlet of that evaporator. That's what that sensing bulb and that external equalizer are. You know how you measure superheat by hooking up a gauge and hooking up a temperature clamp? The TXV has its own little gauge and its own little temperature clamp. The temperature clamp is the bulb, and the gauge is the external equalizer port. It's measuring the superheat at the outlet of that evaporator. It's not doing it with a electronic brain. It's doing it just through pressure comparison between the two. Because that little bulb has a refrigerant charge in it, a saturated refrigerant charge, part liquid, part vapor. And so depending on the temperature, that changes the pressure in that bulb. And then it's also reading the pressure in the suction line and comparing the two mechanically. That's how it balances out the load. So when it needs more refrigerant in the evaporator coil to set the superheat in, it opens. And when it needs less, it closes. It adjusts to different load conditions. So in the evaporator, what is the role? What is the job of the evaporator?
To cool the air.
It evaporates the refrigerant. Now, functionally speaking, this is where the work is done in a refrigeration system. This is where we're doing what it is that we meant to do. So you can also say its job is to absorb heat from whatever is designed to be cooled. So in the case of a refrigerator, the evaporator is what actually creates the temperature differential to take the heat out of your food. If you're talking about an air conditioner, this is where it draws the heat out of the air inside and decreases the temperature inside. That's done by the process of evaporation. The different states inside the evaporator coil, so if you do a 1-2 list, unlike the one, so you have the 1-2-3 list for the condenser, the 1-2 list are number 1, boiling refrigerant, number 2, superheated refrigerant. The evaporator, we want it to fully evaporate the refrigerant, but that's not for efficiency's sake. The most efficient evaporator is a fully flooded evaporator, which means one in which refrigerant is boiling the entire distance, start to finish. Okay? An evaporator works most efficiently if there's boiling refrigerant through the entire thing. But there's a reason we can't do that. Do you know what that reason is? It's because we don't want liquid refrigerant going back into the compressor. And so we need to boil off everything in the evaporator so that we don't have liquid refrigerant going down into the compressor. But from an efficiency standpoint, a flooded evaporator is more efficient. We want to use up as much of that evaporator coil with boiling refrigerant as we possibly can, because that's where the most heat is absorbed. The more refrigerant we put into that coil, the longer it boils into the coil. The less refrigerant we put into the coil, the less it boils in the coil. If you've ever seen a system that's very low, it'll freeze, but it'll only freeze like the first part of the coil. Like you only see like a little bit of freezing and then the rest of it. That's because the pressure's low, so it's boiling very cold, colder than you want it to, below 32 degrees saturation, right? We don't want that because the coil will freeze. But then it's also because there's so few molecules, we're not putting enough refrigerant into it, it boils off quickly. And so you'll actually read a high superheat outside on an extremely low system, even though the beginning of the coil is even frozen. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, because essentially, since it's less there, it boils off quicker in the evaporator, which is why you would get a higher superheat.
Correct.
Because it's boiling off
too soon.
Right.
Correct. You're not filling the bulk of that coil with boiling refrigerant. So it's a factor of the amount of molecules that you're putting into it and the temperature at which they're boiling. Now, the perfectly efficient way to fill an evaporator is to fill it so that it's boiling all the way till the very end, but no more. Because if you put more in, then you're increasing the saturation temperature for no reason. Let's say that you have a system. You walk up to it and the saturation temperature on your gauge is 40. All right? You with me? And you say, I want to make it colder. You read the superheat at the end and it's 40. Which means that it's still boiling in the suction line. That's bad for the compressor, so don't get me wrong here, but that's very efficient for the coil, right? But then you say, I want to make it even colder, let me jack more refrigerant in this thing. And you start increasing the saturation temperature, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, because you're adding more and more pressure into it. That's increasing the saturation. You're making it less efficient now because you've already hit the point that the coil is full of boiling refrigerant. Now you're just increasing the boiling temperature. That makes it less efficient because temperature is the means by which heat is transferred. So by increasing the saturation temperature, you're actually decreasing the rate of heat transfer. Does that make sense? You're making the coil hotter in layman's terms, which doesn't benefit anything. So there's a lot of factors here. One of them is we don't want liquid going into the suction line because that's bad for the compressor. Mm-hmm. The other factor is we don't want to increase the saturation more than we need to because now you're running a hotter coil than you need it to be. But you still have to keep it warmer than 32, because if you ever go below 32, the coil is going to freeze, and that's a problem, right? So you have all of these balancing factors. In addition to that, the compressor requires low temperature vapor in the suction line. Because if it doesn't have low temperature vapor in the suction line, then the compressor runs hot. So the compressor wants cool vapor, it just can't have liquid. Compressors are finicky. They're very demanding. Now on your suction line, that's the line between the evaporator and the compressor. So you write suction line, and that is a low temperature, low pressure, superheated vapor. Superheated just means that it's a vapor, and it's a vapor that's picked up sensible temperature beyond its boiling point. So saying it's a superheated vapor is like saying it's a vapor, right? Just like saying a subcooled liquid is like saying it's a liquid. Subcooled just tells us the amount of time that it's had between becoming a liquid to where it is now. The amount of temperature differential. I say time, but that's...
So essentially where you go to take your reading it will give you a different reading.
Right, and that's true. When we're taking superheat, ideally we would be taking it right at the outlet of the evaporator, because that's where the TXV is taking it. Right? And so we check superheat even on a TXV system, not to charge the system, but to check the health of the TXV. Because if the TXV's job is to set superheat, that's its job, and it's not doing it, then the TXV is not doing its job. However, we're reading superheat at the outside, not at the inside. So you could be picking up heat in your suction line for various reasons. It could be the length of the line. It could be the fact that the line's in a chase that's full of water or something like that. Or it could be uninsulated. And so now the liquid line and the suction line are transferring heat between one another inside the chase. And these are all things that can affect what you're reading outside versus what you're reading inside. So you have to be cognizant of that. If you suspect that issue, then you just check the temperature differential in between the suction line and inside and outside, and liquid line inside and outside. The more differential you have, the more you know that there's also a pressure differential. That's that whole pressure-temperature relationship thing that's really handy. Does that make sense? And that's also why you can't confuse your expansion line with your suction line. You can't confuse your discharge line with your liquid line. They're not the same. If there's anything you're going to learn here that I want you to take away and not forget, it's that these are not the same thing, because you're going to hook up to a package unit someday and you're going to be like, oh, this is the liquid line. Many small packs don't have a port on the liquid line. They just have a port on the discharge line. Well, that makes it dang near impossible to check subcool. When I say a lot, there's a lot of newer ones that do, but a lot of older ones you're going to go to, the ports are right there at the compressor. One's on the discharge line coming out of the compressor, one's on the suction line coming in to the compressor. Now, let's talk about something real quick that will affect you very shortly. All right, there are different types of systems that we work on. We work on straight cool systems, which just means that they're not heat pumps. And then we work on heat pump systems. Okay. The big line that goes in between the air handler and the condensing unit, what do we call that? The large insulated line.
Suction.
We call it the suction line. Okay. Now, as soon as you shift that system in heat mode, is it still the suction line?
Because it's the reversing valve.
Your indoor becomes your condenser, and your condenser becomes your indoor.
Okay, so now your condenser is inside. I want you guys to go through the mental exercise of this. All right? Don't believe anybody else. Go through the mental exercise. So now, inside the house, that coil that we used to call the evaporator is now the condenser. Okay, that's what's happening. That's what the reversing valve does. That's now the condenser. So now, is your compressor inside or outside? Did it move? Did your compressor move?
No.
Can your compressor move?
No.
No. Okay. So now the line that goes in between the outside unit and that inside coil is now what line?
Goes from, where? From your...
So the inside unit's now the condenser coil.
Yeah.
Is now what we used to call the evaporator coil is now the condenser coil in heat mode. We're feeding refrigerant from the compressor outside into what is now the condenser inside. What is that line called?
Your suction line.
What two components does the liquid line go between?
From the condenser to the TXV, or the metering device.
Mm-hmm. Inside now is your condenser coil. What's the line called that goes between the compressor and the condenser?
Discharge line.
Right. That big line is no longer the suction line. It's now the discharge line. Because the compressor's staying outside. The compressor can't move. What's flip-flopping is that what was the evaporator is now the condenser, and what was the condenser is now the evaporator.
So all we're doing is turning that arrow around the other way.
Correct. Well,
effectively, because we're running like this in cool mode. So now we're running like that in heat mode.
And the way we're doing it is by interrupting those lines. So the compressor is not actually pumping reverse. That's what the reversing valve does. Is in the top of that reversing valve goes the discharge line of your compressor, and the bottom of the reversing valve goes the suction line from your compressor. And now these two lines that come in the sides of the reversing valve, you've seen a reversing valve before, right?
May have, but
you didn't pay attention. Okay. It's got 4 lines going into it. And that's all it does is these 2 outside lines on the bottom, they just flip-flop. So it acts like the compressor is running in reverse, but it's not. It's a valve that's doing that. And in fact, think of it that way now. All right. So what was your liquid line? So what was your suction line became your discharge line. So now what was your liquid line? What is it now?
Your expansion line.
Expansion line.
You would be correct, but there's one thing that you don't know. So that's actually you would be correct. You would be. There's one thing you don't know though, is that heat pumps have 2 metering devices. They have one for heat mode that's out on the condensing unit, and they have one for cool mode that's inside.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of a heat mode? We'll talk about a heat mode TXV or a cool mode TXV, inside TXV, outside TXV, on like a Linux or something. Well, in a carrier, the ones that we most often install, the outside metering devices that, that little compression fitting, it's called a chat lift fitting that connects on the outside. It's got that little O-ring in it, and that's what connects the liquid line outside. Mm-hmm. Inside there is a little fixed orifice, a little hunk of brass with a hole through it, and that's a metering device. That's the heat mode metering device. So all that happens in the liquid line is the liquid line stays the liquid line, it just changes direction of flow. And that's why you have a biflow liquid line dryer. Have you ever heard of that? A heat pump liquid line dryer?
Yeah.
It's essentially 2 liquid line dryers in one, so that it can clean the flow of refrigerant and remove moisture going this way or that way.
That's right. It doesn't matter what way you put that one.
Correct.
On. And the other one, you have to
put it in the right way.
Yeah, the right way with the flow.
You got to point it at the metering device, yeah. But in this case, you got 2 metering devices. Now, here's the other kicker with the carrier, and the carrier's weird this way. I don't know why they do this. So if you imagine the liquid line valve that you're connecting to, right? You got your port right here, right? You visualizing this with me? You're connecting your gauges, right?
Okay.
You got your port right here, and you're connecting your gauges. And right here is that little compression fitting that connects in. And inside that compression fitting is the metering device. So this whole line is the liquid line. But where you're connecting is the expansion line, because it's on the other side of that metering device in heat mode. Because in cool mode, the refrigerant's flowing this way, out that liquid line service valve. Now it's flowing this way, but it's hitting that metering device before it hits where you have your gauges connected.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes that a pretty much useless point to connect. So now you have to hook your high side gauge. What was the suction line now becomes the discharge line. What was low pressure, low temperature vapor becomes high pressure, high temperature vapor. And so if you leave your suction gauge connected to that, guess what will happen? Yep. Do you know what it says at the end of a suction gauge? Have you ever looked all the way down at the end of a suction gauge? What is it? It says retard. I'm not going to comment anymore. I think you get the point. Don't leave your suction gauge connected when you're checking in heat mode. All right. You have to take your suction gauge and hook it to that other port, that third port, and that's called common suction. Connects into where it comes out of the compressor so that you can still check your suction pressure. Downside is, at least on this particular, on a carrier system, you can't really check the subcool because you can't check the liquid pressure. Because the only 3 options you have in heat mode are your discharge line, your expansion line, which is just, it's not, this line is the liquid line, but because you're after the metering device, now that's after the metering device, that's the expansion line, and you have your suction, discharge, expansion. You don't have a place to connect the liquid in heat mode. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. You guys look a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, no, all right. A little bit, but yeah, it makes sense.
All right, a couple more things that I want to hit before we take our test. I want to talk about a suction line accumulator. Okay, have you guys ever seen a suction line accumulator before? Suction accumulator looks like another little mini compressor sitting next to the compressor. It's like a little canister. Let's go ahead and pull this. Let's pull this up. A suction accumulator. I don't like this photo, this version of the photo, but it shows it on the top there. What's happening is that where it goes in, it's just a little stub. So that's the one on the left. All right. So it just dumps straight down into this big metals, this big steel shell. The refrigerant going down the suction line in a split system generally, inside the condensing unit, dumps down into this big shell. And then it has this big U-bend, and they don't connect. There it looks like they connect on the left, but they don't. So it's like this. So it dumps in here, and then it draws out the top. So the one on the right is drawing out of the top of the shell, and the one on the left is just dumping down into the shell. Now, the reason why it has a U-bend is down at the bottom there. You see that little circle down at the bottom? That's a screen with a little tiny hole in it. Here's what's happening. When you have an accumulator, all of your suction gas, which should be suction gas, is going into this shell. The reason it is so that it can catch any liquid refrigerant before it's allowed to go back to the compressor to prevent damaging the compressor. So it has a chance to boil inside the shell before it goes into the compressor. It has another place to expand and be allowed to boil, all right? The problem is that oil is moved throughout your entire system. Your compressor is always spitting out little bits of oil. And if it's allowed to spit out little bits of oil and that oil gets trapped someplace and it never gets back to the compressor will die. It's called oil return. You have to let the oil return back to the compressor somehow. Well, if you didn't have a U-bend with that little hole in the screen on the bottom, then your oil would never get back to the compressor because it's dumping into that shell and drawing out the top. Oil's never going to come to the top of that shell. So you want to pool vapor, but you also want to pool a little oil with it. Because of the weights, it creates a strata. The oil goes down to the very bottom, and then liquid, and then vapor. So by drawing out of the very bottom, it draws a little bit of liquid back to a little bit of oil back to the compressor. And the screen is so that it doesn't draw back any other crap that happens to lay down in the bottom of there. Okay. Here's the downside. What happens if that screen gets clogged or that hole gets blocked?
You can't let the oil back.
And then what happens?
Your compressor blows up. Correct.
And the whole thing, not the whole thing, but the accumulator fills with oil. And so this is why, as part of our burnout protocol, whenever you have compressor failure, you should be removing, and really any time you have compressor failure, you should be removing the accumulator, dumping out the oil, and blowing out that accumulator in order to help clear anything that may have blocked it. Because unless you do that, you don't know if that was the problem or not.
So essentially, if you just change out the compressor, you're just wasting money.
Well, no, because the odds that that's what caused the compressor to fail are very slim. You just run the risk that it's a possibility, especially when you have a recurring problem. And it takes a long time for that to happen, too. It's not like the compressor blows out its oil overnight.
Right.
It takes a long time for that to occur. While it's not regular, they're designed not to clog. It can happen. And so when you replace a compressor, you need to be thinking about that. If you have one that's very bad, that's really bad, if it's really bad, the customer should just be replacing the system if it's an older system. Like if you have really bad acid burnout, it's a nasty, nasty deal. But if they choose to do it, part of that protocol, if you have an accumulator, should be just to replace the accumulator. Because then you're safe. You don't have to worry about it. You got a new oil charge. You're not going to, because also that accumulator stores this crappy old burnout oil that's going to sit in the bottom of that accumulator. And if you're putting your suction dryer on the outside, which is part of our burnout protocol to use a suction dryer, that's outside the condenser and then we remove it later. Well, that's not helping protect the compressor because literally it goes accumulator compressor. Accumulator sits right next to it. So anything that's in that accumulator has a good chance of ending up in that compressor. Make sense? Okay, next thing, discharge muffler. We already talked about that. The big thing to know is don't confuse a discharge muffler with a line dryer. They look the same sometimes. Sometimes I've even seen cases where systems installed by the manufacturer have a discharge muffler that says filter dryer on it. Because really, a filter dryer with no guts in it can be used as a muffler. Now, we don't do that, but I've seen a case where a manufacturer did that. I don't remember who it was or when it was. It was years and years and years ago. But you have to think about that. They can look just like a line dryer. And so if you're doing your due diligence, you're like, oh, I'm going to do my job. I'm going to replace any line dryers. Because every time you open a system, you should be replacing any old line dryers with a new one, right? Like liquid line dryers. And so you're like, oh, I'm replacing a compressor. Let me put a new line dryer right here in the discharge line. Well, that's not the liquid line. That's the discharge line. And it can blow the Desiccant out. And that's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is it just won't work as a line dryer. And it'll just restrict the refrigerant flow unduly. The discharge line is not designed to have a dryer in it. Mm-hmm. Got it? Make sense? All right. Next thing is a receiver. This is a small receiver that you might see. And then this is more commonly what you would see. And a receiver is basically a liquid storage tank. So a lot of people get receivers and accumulators confused. Receiver goes in the liquid line. You'll see it in big motor rooms. Just pay attention. Underneath the compressors or beside them, sometimes you'll see these big tanks. And what happens is the compressors pump refrigerant up to the condensers on the roof. They condense the refrigerant, comes down the liquid line, and then stores liquid refrigerant in these giant tanks. So it's dumping liquid refrigerant in and drawing liquid refrigerant out. So it ensures that you have liquid refrigerant, but it allows you to put way more charge in a system. Because now you have this reservoir of extra refrigerant that you can use however you see fit. So in those systems, charge isn't really, you don't hear, like if you have a rack refrigeration system in a grocery store, they don't think in terms of charge like the way we think of it. They just jack it full of hundreds, if not thousands of pounds of refrigerant, and it fills up this big tank, and then it's utilized by the different cases as need be, as load requires. It's not the same way that we think of a closed loop where we add a perfect amount of charge and then that dictates the charge in that system. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a receiver. And then the final thing is a sight glass. Sight glass, have you ever seen one of these before? Okay, generally going to see them on commercial or refrigeration. A sight glass, it just allows you to see the refrigerant in the liquid line. So it performs the exact same function in the subcool. It's taking a subcool reading.
Right.
If there's bubbles in it, then you've got a problem. In fact, the commercial guys that I would work with, they would talk in terms of, well, you got a clear sight glass, and that's how they would say you've got a proper charge. In the same way that we would say you've got a 10 subcool. But subcool's better because it tells you more information than just the fact that you don't have boiling or you don't have refrigerant still condensing in the liquid line.
Color at which that center piece should be.
Right.
So if it's getting discolored, or where it says dry, if it gets that color, that means it's flat.
Well, it's not flat. No, that dry and wet doesn't mean refrigerant or not refrigerant. It means moisture or not moisture.
Oh, okay.
It's telling you whether or not the system has moisture in it, and that is a better purpose. Because subcool, we can all take subcool if you know anything about anything. That's easy. So knowing whether or not there's liquid refrigerant in the liquid line, that's kind of a silly thing with sight glasses, in my opinion. But the litmus paper in there that tells you whether or not there's moisture in the system, that has a greater purpose. And so that system right there is wet, because you see how it's the same color as the wet key on the outside of the sight glass. So if there's one thing that I'm very thankful to my AC instructor about, the first day I came into AC school, he set me in front of a chalkboard. First, he introduced me to the lab and the different people. Then he set me in front of a chalkboard and said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Draw a compressor at the bottom of the chalkboard. Draw a condenser. Draw a metering device. Draw an evaporator. Here's the lines. Here's the different states. Now draw it like 1,000 times. And just keep saying it to yourself until you can say it in your sleep. Compressor, condenser, metering device, evaporator, discharge line, liquid line, expansion line, suction line, discharge line, liquid line, expansion line, suction line. I did it over and over and over again until it just became a part of who I am. So when I look at a system, I don't think in terms of a condensing unit and an air handler, which is what can happen with residential HVAC technicians, which greatly inhibits your ability to diagnose problems. Because you get distracted by the norms of what you're used to seeing. And as soon as you see something different, you see a ductless system, for example, where you don't have a liquid line, or you see a system running in heat mode where the suction line became the discharge line, or you see a commercial package unit where you can't find the expansion line or the discharge line because they're all just small little lines. It can create confusion. Just go through real quick. Tell me the different components and what they do. Who wants to volunteer? Steve will volunteer. He has the most delightful voice. Go ahead. Start with the compressor.
Okay, compressor compresses your refrigerant, then discharges it as a vapor into your condenser.
Look at what line does it go through?
Your discharge line.
Okay, and what are the things that you wrote about the discharge? So just read what you wrote as you go around.
Okay, well, the discharge line is now a vapor. It's high pressure, high temperature, superheat vapor.
Mm-hmm.
Goes into your condenser, which converts the vapor to liquid, which is also known as your outside unit when it's in cool mode, which then will de-superheat, condense, and subcool. Then it will leave via the liquid line, which is high pressure, slightly higher than your outdoor ambient temperature. It will go into your metering device, which reduces the pressure and boils off the liquid. Comes out into your expansion line as low temperature, low pressure, boiling liquid vapor mix.
Mm-hmm.
Into your air handler, your evaporator.
Very good. Yeah, I like the switch there. Evaporator, yeah.
Evaporator, which will take the heat out of the air, the inside of the house in this term. Your 2 points of that is boiling your refrigerant to superheat refrigerant. It then comes out into your suction line as low temp, low pressure, superheated vapor, and then back into your compressor to start again.
Sweet. You guys, I think you guys are refrigeration experts now.
Yes.
What do you think? Coincidentally, another thing I want to mention, because we're going into the season where you're going to start seeing pool heat pumps. All right, this is a perfect example of this. You notice a pool heat pump doesn't have a separate, it's just one unit. There's no air handler or condenser, it's just one unit, right? Well, that outdoor coil on a pool heat pump, you guys have all seen pool heat pumps, right? Yeah. The three of you? Okay, yeah. Right. That outdoor coil looks like a condenser, right? It's not. It's an evaporator. You got this big coil that looks like a condenser coil, like what we're used to seeing. Well, that functions like a heat pump air conditioning system in heat mode. The outside coil is always an evaporator. And then inside of that unit, there is a water-cooled condenser. And that water, the water-cooled condenser, is where it heats the water. So when you're saying water-cooled, it means that it's cooling the refrigerant with water, meaning that the water is getting warmer.
Yeah, the water's taking out the heat.
Correct. And so, and that happens by refrigerant and water flowing in opposite directions in tubes that are touching each other. good for you to know, because when you're connecting to that system, you're going to be connecting to a lot of discharge lines. You're going to be connecting to a lot of suction lines, and it's going to be confusing as heck. And you're going to wonder why that outdoor coil's condensating and growing algae on it. Well, why would a condenser do that? Well, it's because it's not a condenser. And that's why they get so algae bound, is because they're condensing moisture off all the time, because it's a giant evaporator. And it's also why they freeze and turn into giant blocks of ice when defrost isn't working properly, or when property managers try to run them at night when it's 30 degrees outside, which is also not a good idea. This lesson is very hands-on. If you weren't actually writing down the stuff as you went, you're not going to get nearly as much out of it. So I would suggest, if you're listening to it in the car or whatever, listen to it again and actually draw out the different components as you go. Obviously, for senior guys, if you've been through school and you've done this before, then it's not going to be any benefit to you. But how many guys who have even been in the trade for years who still get confused between the difference between a discharge line and a liquid line. So I think this has benefit even to people who have been in the field for a while in certain cases. So thank you again for being part of the HVAC School podcast, and we'll talk to you next time.